I know that the principle of fallibility and reflexivity is against making predictions, so I'll try to make a prediction anyway. And my prediction is that everybody who is interested in the thinking of George Soros should come back to these lectures. I do believe this was one of the most intensive type of rethinking your own philosophy for the last 20 years, and nothing is done more than on the concept of open society. I have been rereading yesterday the book Opening the Soviet System that have been basically wrote 20 years ago. And then the situation looks slightly more clear. You have the open society. By the way, the open society, and this is very much according to also Popper, was based on the idea of a democracy inhabited by scientists, critically thinking people in a very critical mode, which experimenting with the idea and not being afraid of failing. And of course, this type of a confrontation between open society and closed society was a formative experience for our generation. I do believe we're going to a much more difficult period in which Karl Popper met Karl Rove. And the problem of a simple dichotomy between open society and closed society is not as useful as it was. So as a result of it, I'm very grateful to George Soros for making this type of talk. And I just want to make 3 points and ask 2 questions. The first point is very much about this manipulative function. Popper himself, at the end of his life, became obsessed with television. All his latest interviews have been attack on television. But he never went to attack his concept because it is not about television, this is about liberal rationalism. How rational it could be, it's very much the Enlightenment fallacy, and he basically decided to stay with it. I do believe that what Mr. Soros has done today, first of all, is much more intellectually honest. Being between 2 fallacies, the Enlightenment fallacy and the postmodern fallacy, this is the problem of a moral and tragic choice where you stand. Nobody can simply say one is fallacy and the other is not a fallacy, but you need a kind of a religion of your own. And this tragic nature of modern liberalism, in my view, is something to be stressed against a very naive type of things which basically believe that liberalism is natural and self-obvious and nothing to be done. The second problem is all these arguments which are coming with the postmodern fallacy are not new ones. If you go back to history, Plato's criticism of democracy is very much about the rule of the sophists, people who are not interested in truth, who simply try to persuade the others. And honestly speaking, it's much easier to talk truth to power than to talk truth to the voters. And from this point of view, rethinking electoral democracy in terms of open society, I see as the major challenge. And from this point of view, this lecture is very different from many things that we have heard before. But if this is the case, I have 3 questions. The first has a lot to do with the problem of politics, and I mean government. Comparing your lecture from yesterday and your lecture today, yesterday you put much more trust in government, in regulating economy. Now when we know how much the manipulative function have taken precedence in politics, how sure you are that the government is going to fulfill the function that you subscribe to this when it comes to the economy. And second is when we know now that it's not only the cognitive function, but this is also the manipulative function. Are you in a mood to rethink the way you have been supporting education or the way you're working with media in your foundations? Because basically part of the supremacy of the education was also part of the Enlightenment view of the world. It was enough to educate the people, to inform them. The informed citizen was the ideal. Now the citizen can be informed, but he can be uninformed in a very manipulative way. So in a certain way, I do believe that you're coming to a radical moment in which we're so much used to take democracy and open society for granted that it takes your talk to start asking questions, which are so old that we have forgotten the answers. Thank you very much.
I won't comment. We can open the tap. We can open the door.
Yeah. So, but this was, I do believe also there are going to be much more important questions that are going to come from the audience. Like yesterday, we're going to give the precedence to New York and to the Columbia University students who are there. So they're going to have the first 3 questions. Please.
I'm the Senior Associate Dean here at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. And I'd like to thank you first for including us in this teleconference. It's an honor for us to be involved, and thank you on behalf of Dean John Coatsworth. We have a number of students who have interesting questions prepared for you. I'd like to invite them to come up to the podium and join me and to introduce themselves as they present their questions. The first student who I'd like to ask to come to the podium is Ms. Zhou. Please join me here. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Soros. My name is Cilian Zhou. I'm a first-year student at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. I was born in Beijing, and I read your theory about reflexivity before. I have 2 quick questions for you. First one is, you mentioned the term the pursuit of knowledge, which I agree that it takes willingness and, in my opinion, tremendous commitment. But more importantly, I think it takes significant resources too. For example, I need to pay for Columbia to listen to your lecture today. But for the majority of the population, people don't have enough resources, especially economic resources, to pursue the reality. That's why a political machine has room to manipulate. So in your opinion, is there any solution to this problem, for example, by devoting more resources, perhaps more than the manipulative power spends, to promote the open society?
So there was a very interesting question coming. Yeah. So probably we should answer question by question, because she's very much interested when you don't have an access to education and cannot get knowledge, how you can defend yourself from the manipulative power of the governments, and how you see the solution of this.
Yeah. Well, obviously, education education of the electorate is very important in developing an open society, and access to education is an important requirement. And basically, many countries accept, most developed countries accept that responsibility. In recent years, there's been an increasing tendency to charge fees. This is in Europe, but only at the university level. And I think that there ought to be, I mean, you could argue that people who get a university education get a leg up in the world, that it's proven that their income afterwards is substantially higher than others. So maybe they ought to pay for that privilege, but maybe they ought to pay for it later. In a way, in America, you have universities that give scholarships but collect from alumni, and I think that's a very good system, actually. I'm all in favor of making education more widely available, but it may be appropriate for to have student loans available. That has been abused in America. So it is an issue. How can one provide the best educational opportunities, equality of opportunity in education?
Thank you very much. You have a second question?
Yes. And my second question has something to do with China. So when it comes to China, the culture of this country emphasized central authority since more than 2,500 years ago. And so far, it seems to have limited impact on its economic growth and the quality of foreign policies. So my question is, in the long run, Do you think the clash between manipulative power and the public awareness of reality will influence China and the structure of the world?
It's a very good question about China. Years ago, it was going to be a question about Russia too, and it was about the political culture. And to a certain extent, where political culture is going to stay in your definition of the open society, because the question here was, where do you see the trend? If China is going to overcome this culture of a centralized government and very much more obedient relations to power.
Yes. No, I mean, you're absolutely right that the history of China is an imperial history with the ruler having a lot of power and the subjects being subjected to various kinds of rules. Some more harsh than others. And it is to be hoped that China will develop into a more open society as it gains a power and influence in the world. Because I think that there is in China a great desire and need for stability. It's because of the history of China. People are very concerned about maintaining stability. And that, of course, relies on the state power. So China today cannot yet be considered an open society. But as China becomes an influential great power in the world, and it needs to be accepted by the rest of the world. And the Chinese leadership will have to pay more attention to what the rest of the world thinks about China, because that is the way for China to rise and become more influential.
Thank you very much for your questions. Probably two more questions from Columbia, from New York.
Good morning and good evening for you. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting. My name is Alexander Ilchuk, and I'm a graduate student of School of International Affairs here at Columbia. I'm from Ukraine. And I have a question. How do you see the way a society can evolve into avoiding manipulative mode of government? And what is the role of intellectual elites in that process? How do you see this?
The question was, what is the role of the intellectual elites to prevent this rise of manipulative governments? And this is a question of somebody who comes from Ukraine, so he knows what he speaks about.
Yeah, I think your question is very, very relevant, because I firmly believe that an open society does need an intellectual elite. And that is not a very popular idea today, because everything tends towards egalitarianism. And I think that is actually dangerous for an open society, because you have one person, one vote, right? But the educational level, the level of understanding, seriousness, etc., of different people is not the same. And therefore, there needs to be well-informed people who are concerned with the public interest, who take more interest, express their views, and their views gain some respect. In England, basically democracy developed under the careful guidance of the aristocracy, people who held themselves to pretty high standards and so on. And they had also the leisure to be concerned with public affairs. And I think we need more of that because these issues are not that easy to understand. And if now with the various methods of reaching the broad public, the intellectuals, the elite, is more concerned with manipulating, reducing messages to a level where it gets a lot of traction. So the elite has to have a commitment to the pursuit of truth. And then it has to have influence in the general public. I think those are the conditions that you actually need for a flourishing open society.
Thank you very much. And one more question from New York. After that, we're going to come to Budapest, and probably we'll go back to New York later.
Hi, I'm Matthew Flagg. I'm a second-year PhD student in the economics department. Mr. Soros, you mentioned that in order for an open society to function, the cognitive function of our thinking must take precedence over the manipulative function. But as we've discussed, those who espouse the manipulative function seem dedicated to the end of suppressing the objective reality. In your view, beyond the role of education, as we've already discussed, is it an achievable goal to have the majority of people in a society dedicated to the pursuit of truth? And if so, how can we go about achieving this goal in the face of opposition to the truth from the manipulators? Do you believe perhaps that the media could play a role in this, and how could they go about doing this?
Yeah, media. No, Puato is going to be, I do believe, happy to listen to this question, because the question was, do you expect that they are going to be the majority of the truth seekers in a society? And if they're not going to be such a majority beyond education, where you are going to see the solution? What should be the role of the media, and basically what is the role of the media?
Well, let me take a very elitist point of view. And I think that even a very small percentage of the population that is genuinely concerned with the public interest can make a big difference. Because you could see that the competition between the various political views usually bring you very, very close to 50%. It's an interesting question why that is. But there is a convergence around a 50-50 split, and it's a very, very narrow difference that actually wins or loses votes. So if you just have just a few percent that is particularly, let's say, is concerned with the pursuit of truth, it could make a tremendous difference. Now, the question of media is a very, very troubling question, because media has two functions. On the one hand, it's an indispensable element in an open society. It has an institutional role. On the other hand, it's a business. And as a business, it has to cater to the demand. And if there is no demand for serious information, but for entertainment, then the media that is going to be popular and read by a lot of people or listened to by a lot of people is not going to be concerned with serious discussion of affairs. So in the end, it really does come down to the electorate.
Thank you very much. We're going to Budapest, but as we heard, there is a good news for you. You don't need a majority of truth seekers. You should have them only in the swinging states. So, please, let's go with the questions from Budapest. Please, Magdalena. There is a question here. Mark.
Thank you. I actually covered the 2004 election as a reporter. So in a sense, I'm on both sides of this question, a representative of the media, and I hope some kind of truth seeker. I'm afraid, though, that my verdict, at least from my experience covering that election, is going to be a bit dismaying with respect to what you've told us here today. I was struck again and again when I interviewed people at rallies, particularly at rallies for George W. Bush. And I'm talking about educated people, people who read the New York Times every day and so on. The number of times I would be told, for example, that weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. And these, again, were not benighted people. They read the press. They were perfectly able to read in the press that weapons were not found. But I gradually came to the view that our whole model of how people understand politics very often is wrong. We tend to think of it as a kind of inductive process by which people gather facts and then make a judgment about a political candidate or a policy according to how it conforms to the truth of those facts. And in fact, I found again and again that people would begin with a belief, in this case, a belief in George W. Bush and his leadership, and then they would assemble the facts to accord with that original belief. And when they came to a conflict that was particularly strong, and the fact that weapons of mass destruction, having served as the occasion or the reason for the war, were then not found, when they came to that kind of strong conflict, they simply rejected it out of hand. And I saw this and heard this so much, and from people who were, again, educated, had critical faculties of the sort that you've just described, had been to the elite schools in the United States, that it struck me very strongly that much of the way we think about how people make decisions about politics may well be wrong. I'm sorry, that's a long way to get to the point of, if indeed my conclusion or what I discovered is true, what are the implications for your view of the open society and what's necessary to it?
Well, actually, I would be interested in your conclusions from your experience. But I do think that at around that time, there was really an increased disregard for facts in the information that people were getting. And there was a propaganda machine that was parading as legitimate media. Fox television, their motto was, what was it, fair and balanced, or fair and balanced, which was an Orwellian statement. And it did actually mislead people because they were getting this information as if it was information, and it was deliberate misstatement of facts. So, and you had it from politicians like Vice President Cheney, who had absolutely no hesitation saying things that were actually untrue. So, coming from authoritative sources, I think it did sway the public. Now, you could say that the public is responsible because they put up with it, and I think they are. But I think that this was a particularly dark period in American public discourse. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, but that certainly was my impression.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much. My question is very simple. Do you believe that the pursuit of truth leads to an education for truth, and this leads for moral values on education?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I personally seem to have this particular quest or emotional commitment. But I think it's easy to have different set of values. If you've been reasonably successful living a myth that you have created, then there's nothing to stop you from doing it. So it's not that that's exactly otherwise. If the truth eventually had to convince you, then of course people would be convinced that the problem wouldn't be there. So actually, and particularly, since when it comes to natural phenomena, we have learned that illusions don't work as well as a proper understanding of the laws of nature. Starting with the alchemists, who used incantation to try to make gold out of base metals, and they never succeeded. Human affairs are different. You can actually succeed. That's the whole point of why reflexivity makes human affairs so very different. If the alchemists, if they had been active in the financial markets, they would probably be prospering, because you can actually change reality by incantation. So that's how human affairs are different from natural affairs. And so the truth doesn't have the same convincing power, because it can itself be modified. It can be manipulated. And that's really why we have this problem.
Thank you very much. There was 2 questions there. Please.
I was actually very disturbed by this idea of manipulative function. I actually lived through both 2004 and 2008 elections in the US as a foreigner, and what struck me in your speech, in your lecture, was that you did not mention the 2008 campaign and the Obama strategy, which was profoundly manipulative by your definition. I mean, it was obviously truth, but it was truth well told. And I think because of the well told element, it was so persuasive. That's why Obama beat Senator Clinton in the primaries and then was so strongly positioned in the general election. If you agree that there was an element of charisma and manipulation and selling the truth in his campaign, then there is a real dilemma, because obviously to change the society away from manipulative state, we need to gain political power, but to do this, we need to join the game of manipulating. And then it is a moral problem that I would like to know how to explain to my students here.
No, I would have to... I really have to differ from you, because clearly Obama had political advisors, and they were telling him what to say and what not to say and so on. But there was a very different attitude that Obama expressed. And he treated the electorate as intelligent people and talked to them as intelligent people. Now, he wasn't widely heard, but the tone and the intention and the standards that he applied were really, to me, actually remarkably different from the other side. The difference was in 2008 was as great as it was in 2004. Now, I may be biased, so in fact, I am biased. Nevertheless, I believe this to be true. So, however, of course, you can't avoid taking into account the fact that people's perceptions can be manipulated, and I think if you disregard it, you have no chance of getting elected.
Thank you very much. Before going there, I remember politicians from the communist period on this token manipulation who used to say, we are saying the truth, only the truth, but not the whole truth. Okay. So from this point, there is a question there.
Hello, Alexander Altunian, Moscow, one of Moscow universities, and now CAU visiting researcher. Let me be in kind of advocate for devil. Founding fathers didn't promise pursuing of truth. They just promised pursuing of happiness and freedom. Isn't it enough? Or was they wrong? I mean, was it understandable? I mean, they didn't say nothing about pursuing of truth. They said that every man could pursue the happiness, and every man is free. So maybe it's enough, or we should pursuing the truth.
Yeah. The question was, and of course it's an interesting one, he said, when you have been referring to the founding fathers said nothing about the truth. They were about pursuing of happiness and freedom. Do you need truth in order to be free and happy? This is the question in a way I got it here.
I definitely think so, because of this, the importance of understanding reality in order to be able to lead a successful life, make an impact on reality, the way you get the results that you want, as opposed to unintended adverse consequences. So to eliminate, to reduce the adverse consequences, you need to understand. And you need to understand that in the case of human affairs, reality is not a passive target that you shoot at. It's a moving target. And how people perceive it and how people act changes the reality that you have to deal with. So the reality in human affairs is much more difficult to understand, but nevertheless you need to understand it in order to narrow the divergence between your intentions and expectations on the one hand and the outcome on the other. That's the same in both in dealing with nature and with humanity. But in the case of human affairs, it's much more difficult because it's a moving target, because reality can, in fact, be manipulated.
Thank you very much. Professor Gaspar.
George, I loved your lecture. I would like to make a few comments disagreeing with you, but I had to make a comment about our last questioner. The expression happiness in the Declaration of Independence is much closer to the French félicité and really meaning public welfare to a very large extent. So this is not individual happiness, it is liberty and public welfare. And of course, public welfare immediately gets us back to the pursuit of truth. And I have really no question that the framers, the founding fathers, were deeply Enlightenment characters committed to the pursuit of truth. So, George, I have a couple of comments. One is about elections. Well, I think elections have been Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government except for all others. Elections have been incredibly problematic for whenever we have had genuine elections, let us say for the last 100 years. And talk about the manipulative function. Here in Hungary, we just had a rather extreme example recently of that in an election campaign. Never mind, of course, Hitler, etc. So, what the electorate does in response to politicians who, as you said, want to be re-elected or want to get office and who are highly manipulative in many ways is never to be quite known, but my own experience over the last decades has led me to believe if elections come out the right way, we are very lucky. It is then those few percent you just mentioned. But on the whole, electors are vastly overtaxed in making complex decisions about what the facts are or what the policies should be. Health policy, let us say, or take any such thing. So that gets me to the other side of open society, and where I am in complete agreement with you, and which I think has for me become vastly more important in a way than elections. I obviously believe we have to have elections, and I'm all for them, and I vote regularly. But the conditions, freedom of speech, freedom of association, access to media, all of those things that can help us in the pursuit of truth are, for me, have become over the years much more important, really, than the electoral process as such, which is also so confined by artificial arrangements about majorities and what have you. So it is really the vigor of a civil society, not necessarily using the term the way it is fashionable these days, but the vigor of a civil society that is our only hope. And there, I think, as a matter of fact, the United States comes out very well, because we still have a society where lots and lots of people dig for the facts, pursue the truth, use the Freedom of Information Act and so on, and show the Bush lies for what they were. So that's it. Okay. It was a comment.
I agree with you entirely on the importance of the institutions, and in fact, elections can often be a detriment to the development of those institutions. In some of the countries that I have foundations, take a country like Kazakhstan. There is no way that the ruling group is going to allow another group to take possession of the state when there's so much oil there and so much revenue and so much is at stake. So actually, elections very often just more or less push the regime into repression when without elections, they might actually be more relaxed. I mean, this is a rather unorthodox view, but I don't think that elections do much good in those countries. So I entirely agree with you. And yet, gradually, you could see a country like Kazakhstan, exactly because it does have natural resources, perhaps develop the institutions that will eventually lead to democratic elections even. But on the other point that you make, that really elections don't matter that much, I think there has been a change in America in the structure of the political parties, because with the two-party system, the dynamics were always for both parties to try to capture the middle in order to gain a majority. And then, about roughly 25 years ago, a little longer than that, 30-odd years ago, the Republican Party was basically came under the influence people with fairly extreme views who moved the country further towards their views and did not move towards a compromise position. And then the Democrats tried to capture the middle, so they moved more and more towards certain ideology. I call it market fundamentalism, but that's only part of it, because, of course, in the case of the Bush administration, it had to do with military power and et cetera, and the unitary presidency, so the presidential power. So at any rate, instead of two parties moving towards the middle, you had one party moving further and further to the right, whatever that may be, and the other party trying to capture it, and the whole political scene shifted very radically during our lifetime in America.
Thank you very much.
And therefore, the elections became more important. Before, you know, so it was one party or the other. It didn't make that much difference. And there were basically certain values as well as institutions. You mentioned the importance of institutions, but I think certain values of, public probity, which may have been hypocritical, but nevertheless, they were the supposed values that were guiding the people.
Just to make a comment, probably elections could be a fertile fallacy. Because if you see the elections in places like Ukraine 2005 and others, even elections that are perceived as failing can mobilize public energy. So from this point of view, I do believe that elections really has a problem of their own, but unfortunately I cannot see what is going to replace them for the moment. So please.
Hello, I'm Ellen Hume. I'm an Annenberg Fellow at CEU's Center on Media and Communication Studies. You've taken us on quite a journey with your lectures so far. And today in particular, when you were talking about the fate of our political culture, not just in America, but much more broadly, it was a pretty sad, a pretty tragic picture of culture today. And what I'm trying to smoke out is whether you're a pessimist or an optimist. And before you answer, I want to couch it in a little context. I've just returned from 2 African countries where I've been trying to craft arguments very similar to what your wonderful foundations have done about why governments should allow free press and free speech. And one of the arguments, actually, I heard a little bit of in your talk today, and that was that governments that live by propaganda tend to start believing their own propaganda, and therefore the objective reality comes and gets them in the end. So is there a hope in your mind, or maybe I am too hopeful, that our culture will shift yet again to a more reality-based operation, since there is ultimate failure, like death, built into the propaganda machine?
No, I'm very hopeful that it will, actually. And I don't think that it's a one-way street of decline, and the past was not as glorious as I may have implied in my speech. I think there were periods of when things were working very well in certain countries, and then they declined. I've been rather shocked by the decline in America. And that's genuinely, I feel that, and it was a surprise to me. I think that the whole Bush phenomenon was a shock to me, because, I came from Hungary, where America was looked up, there's a certain idealistic view of America as being the home of democracy and so on. So it was, and I think that there is actually something that has gone wrong. It needs to be corrected. I think the fact that Obama was elected was a tremendous change. And yet, I'm troubled that the public opinion hasn't shifted as much as the fact that as a totally different kind of president was elected. And the political discourse hasn't changed all that much. So there is, I think, something seriously wrong in America today, but it doesn't mean that the world is going to hell in a basket or that the past was always wonderful.
Thank you. There is a question there. In Bulgaria, we try to believe that the pessimist is somebody who believes that it cannot be worse, but the optimist knows that it could be.
Okay, I am from CEU. I am a doctoral student in law, and I am also from Kenya. My question relates to what you seem to be concluding in terms of back to the founding fathers. Why I am a bit troubled with that is because much as they were saying about self-evident truths, they belong to a particular class. Their truths did not include the Africans who they still enslaved. Their truth did not include, for instance, even women, or it was specific truths. And yet that is where you kind of fall back. And looking at American society, you would say it's an American society. American society has been kind of open. But internally, perhaps, when you look at its foreign policy, there is nothing open about it. It is the one that has been preaching in my country, for instance, that Kenya, about market fundamentalism that you're talking about, that has caused a lot of problems. Here at CEU, I'm grappling with the question of enforcement of socioeconomic rights. So my question to you is, how open is this concept to other realities that perhaps, that there are so many people who could be excluded from participation because of deprivations and all that, and yet perhaps the main talk I hear is about, okay, free press, the civil and political rights, perhaps neglecting the socioeconomic rights. And I understand, of course, coming from the communist system, communist realities, it's perhaps, your realities also shape what kind of vision you would have. So that's the question. How open is really the open society that you think you are thinking about?
Yeah. You see, I've been stressing the difference between our view of the world and the way the world actually is. And certainly, let's say, America had the view of the world which believed in equality, human rights, individual freedom, and so on. And at the same time, you had slavery at the time of the founding fathers. And when you talk about market fundamentalism, I think it is a totally false pretense. You see, this invisible hand of the market that provides equal opportunity to all. Well, behind the invisible hand of the market, there is the visible hand of politics, and which sets the rules. And while actually the international system established at Bretton Woods and at the United Nations was on the surface a very rule of law kind of sort of equal treatment for each. There's no question that the United States, which basically set the rules, was more equal than the others. And it was not immediately obvious, but it's very definitely the case. So I have a lot of sympathy with your position.
Please.
Colin McGinn. George, I find it interesting and perhaps a little ironic that you today have come around to defending a conception of politics rather like Plato's. I mean, ironic because of your being a follower of Popper, who of course was very against Plato. The reason I say this is that you're emphasizing today the point that Popper neglected, and you earlier neglected, the influence of propaganda and manipulation in politics and in democracies today. Of course, that problem was what Plato saw all along was the problem of democracy. It was the problem of the sophists, as you pointed out, manipulators of opinion. As a defense against that problem, Plato advocated an intellectual elite who'd be trained in certain ways and would be committed to the truth. He called them the philosopher kings, of course, and they would be protection against the sophists. This, of course, is anathema to Popper and other liberal Democrats because it seems to give more political power to this elite than to the run of the population. So I wonder whether you'd like to comment on whether you think you've become, unlike Popper, a Platonist about politics.
Basically, the question was, are you not becoming much more on the Plato side than on the Popper side? Because it was much more Plato who had been pushing for the philosophers to run in order basically to have an elite which can counterbalance the manipulative power of the sophists.
Yes, I think, I mean, it's well known that Popper was a little too hard on Plato to start with. But I've actually had more trouble with Lee Kuan Yew than with Plato, because, you know, Lee Kuan Yew was sort of a philosopher king running the country, and running it with a pretty harsh hand and suppressing opposition. And yet, he guided Singapore very successfully. And I found that really quite distressing in a way, that he could be as successful while suppressing alternative views. And I mean, even you look at China today, it's not very far from an open society. But there is a kind of a social contract where people accept the authority of the rulers in order to have stability and economic progress. And the rulers know that they have to provide stability and economic progress in order to be the rulers. And actually, it's working very well as a machine that is moving China forward, whereas America, which is a democracy, and you have freedom of all kinds of freedoms guaranteed, basically half the Congress is out to trip up the other half, and a tremendous amount is lost in the adversarial fighting. So I have to observe these things. They kind of don't fit into the conceptual framework with which I'm still operating. I'm modifying the conceptual framework, but I have to recognize that democracy is not necessarily a superior form of social organization. It requires something more than democracy for that to be the case. And I've identified the pursuit of truth as that something more that has to be there. But it really means a set of values also where people are sufficiently public-minded to be concerned with the public good. I'll deal with that issue in the next lecture, actually, because I think that's a very important additional requirement for an open society to be successful.
Thank you very much. There was a question very early on, and I feel guilty that, yeah.
Thank you. I would like to join on the debate about the manipulation in politics, and I think the key word is consciousness. So, ideal voter in an ideal country would listen to every political party speak, and he would say that yes, he wanted to operate with my feelings. He just lied, or he's not the man of this country. So he would decide this, and he just wouldn't vote on this party or on this man. And my family has Sweden friends who said to me that it is existing in Sweden. So if a party would say to the Sweden people that we would lower the taxes if you would vote on us, then they would just laugh at them, and it couldn't be a party. And do you think that Americans don't have this type of consciousness, or is it lack of the American society?
The question, if I'm going to interpret it crudely, is, do you believe that because the Americans are for lowering the taxes, they don't have a moral feeling? Don't have a moral feeling. Moral feeling, or moral something.
Yes. I think that there is a very serious problem in America now with values. And I think the market fundamentalism, this belief that the pursuit of self-interest somehow has a moral support in this invisible hand of the market that assures that people pursuing self-interest reach the best allocation of resources. It's a false interpretation of markets, of society, and it has become extremely powerful because it happens to be very greatly beneficial to the owners and managers of capital. It's a very satisfactory set of beliefs for them. And therefore, they actually were willing to invest very serious amounts of money and effort to manipulate public opinion where it has been accepted as the truth. And we just had the collapse of the financial markets, which ought to bring about a serious questioning whether this set of this ideology actually is well-founded or not. I am, of course, very much a critic of it.
I don't want to manipulate you, and I'm going to tell you the truth. We have 3 minutes, and there's at least 7 or 8 questions being there. So on this truthful note, I'll go to give Diane Stone the possibility to ask a question, and I do believe that the other questions after that probably we can discuss outside of the room. Diane.
Thank you. Diane Stone from the Department of Public Policy here at CEU. I've been struck this afternoon how much the discussion about politics has been very much focused on the nation state, talking about political parties, elections, the American political culture. So my question would be, to what extent is the notion of open society linked to the nation state as a society, or the degree to which open society can be delinked and associated with the ways in which society is forming in new forms, transnationally through the internet and various other kinds of associations, so regional association, for example. and the extent to which open society could operate through things like Twitter, for example. And also, is this a domain where the threats and challenges to open society are perhaps greater than at the national level?
The very last sentence was...
This is where the challenge is to the open society.
Yes. No, I think it's an excellent question, and clearly the problems confronting humanity transcend the national borders, and because of the globalization of financial markets, etc., actually the financial markets have become global. The economy, of course, has become global, but the political system remains founded on the principle of sovereignty. And that has very serious, creates very serious problems. And unless we solve that problem, actually the global markets will disintegrate. But more than that, for instance, we are going to cook because of global warming, because we will not be able to solve that problem. It's not one that can be solved on a national basis. So we actually have to make some very important steps forward in the form of international governance to catch up with the globalization of our civilization.
Thank you very much. I want to excuse myself for those who didn't manage to take the floor. There are going to be 2 more lectures, so you're going to have your opportunity. Thank you very much to our colleagues from New York. They had the first word, they didn't get the last one, but I do believe they're also going to get their chance. And the rector.
Well, I want to thank our audiences here in Budapest and in New York. I think through open discourse, we have explored the challenges and opportunities of open society. Tomorrow, these ideas will be explored even further when Mr. Soros looks at what he sees as a conflict between open society and economic fundamentalism. So be prepared to return and engage in further stimulating conversation of the type we've had here today. For now, let me express gratitude to our expert moderator, Ivan Krashtev, and ask you once again to join me in thanking our extraordinary lecturer, George Soros.